The Napa Valley estate stood like a jewel against the backdrop of rolling vineyards, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow across the perfectly manicured lawns. The air was fragrant with the scent of roses and ripe grapes, yet inside the grand hall, tension simmered. Guests in elegant attire milled about, their hushed whispers blending into a soft hum of anticipation. Ethan Carter stood near the large bay windows, his broad shoulders tense beneath his tailored navy suit. His perfectly styled dark hair and piercing green eyes gave him an air of authority, but his expression betrayed a growing impatience. He glanced at his sleek silver watch, the gesture sharp and deliberate. "She's late," Ethan muttered under his breath, turning to the bride, Clara, a lifelong friend whose wedding had brought him to this idyllic venue. His voice carried just enough irritation to reveal that he was unused to waiting. Clara, radiant in her ivory gown, reached out to squeeze his arm reassuringly. "Relax, Ethan. Isabel's always a little unpredictable. She'll be here." Before he could respond, the grand oak doors creaked open, drawing every eye to the entrance. A rush of late autumn breeze accompanied Isabel Morgan as she hurried inside, clutching the hem of her soft lavender dress. The vision that greeted Ethan was anything but polished. Her long auburn hair was wind-tossed, her flushed cheeks glowing with exertion. Her shoes, one beige heel and one black flat, clashed comically, yet she carried herself with a kind of chaotic grace that was both endearing and utterly captivating. Ethan blinked, taken aback. This was the bridesmaid who had kept everyone waiting? His initial irritation dissolved into intrigue as his eyes took in every detail. The way her mismatched shoes didn't deter her confident stride, the way her nervous smile transformed her features into something mesmerizing. As Isabel approached Clara, she murmured apologies, her voice soft but warm. "Sorry. Traffic was a nightmare, and then my heel broke and—" Clara waved her off with a laugh, pulling her into a quick hug. "You made it, and that's what matters." Ethan, still rooted in place, found himself watching Isabel more closely than he intended. Her energy was infectious, her presence magnetic. She seemed to carry a whirlwind with her, but beneath the fluster, there was a quiet strength that intrigued him. "Ethan," Clara said, snapping him out of his thoughts. "This is Isabel, my cousin." Isabel turned, and for the first time, their eyes met. Ethan extended his hand automatically, his usual confident demeanor faltering slightly. "Ethan Carter," he introduced himself. "Isabel Morgan," she replied, her smile wry as she glanced down at her mismatched footwear. "First impressions, huh?" "Unforgettable," Ethan said before he could stop himself. A faint blush crept up Isabel's neck, but she quickly recovered. "Well, that's one way to spin it." As she joined the other bridesmaids, Ethan found himself glancing her way more than once. He told himself it was curiosity, but deep down, he knew it was something more. Isabel Morgan had arrived like a storm, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she had just changed the course of his carefully ordered life. The ceremony unfolded under the open skies, with sunlight dancing across the rows of seated guests. The bride, Clara, stood radiant beneath the floral arch, her vows bringing smiles and tears to everyone present. Ethan Carter, however, found himself barely paying attention. His focus was pulled elsewhere, to Isabel Morgan, standing among the bridesmaids, her presence as magnetic as the sun-drenched scenery around them. From the moment she stepped into the ceremony, Isabel had captured Ethan's attention in a way no one else ever had. She wasn't conventionally polished like the other bridesmaids, who stood poised and graceful in their matching lavender dresses. Yet, there was something about her quiet confidence that made her stand out. Her mismatched shoes had been swapped for borrowed flats, one size too big, and her auburn hair was hastily tamed into a loose braid. But the imperfections only seemed to amplify her charm. She didn't carry herself like someone worried about appearances. Instead, she seemed completely at ease, even catching herself humming along to the soft strains of the string quartet as the ceremony progressed. Ethan's gaze lingered longer than it should have. He told himself it was idle curiosity. After all, Isabel's whirlwind arrival had been hard to ignore. But as the minutes passed, he realized there was more to it than that. At one point, Isabel caught him staring. Her lips curved into a teasing half-smile, her hazel eyes glinting with amusement. Ethan quickly averted his gaze, a faint blush creeping up his neck. It was an unusual reaction for him. As a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and effortlessly charming socialites, he wasn't used to being caught off guard, especially not by someone like Isabel. When the bride and groom exchanged their vows, Isabel's expression softened, her playful demeanor giving way to something more wistful. Ethan noticed the way her fingers absent-mindedly traced the delicate bracelet on her wrist, as though it held some deep meaning. The sunlight caught the tiny charms dangling from it, a paintbrush, a heart, a book, and he wondered what stories those charms might tell. As the ceremony concluded with a burst of applause, Isabel clapped enthusiastically, her laughter ringing out above the crowd. The sound was light, genuine, and it stayed with Ethan as they all made their way to the reception area. By now, Ethan had resigned himself to the fact that he was undeniably drawn to her. Yet, he couldn't pinpoint why. Isabel was unlike anyone he'd met, refreshingly unpolished, full of quiet contradictions. She seemed both carefree and deeply thoughtful, as if she carried secrets she wasn't ready to share. At the reception, the mood was lively. The outdoor garden was transformed into a romantic wonderland, with twinkling fairy lights draped across the trees and tables laden with exquisite dishes. Guests mingled, laughter and music filling the air. Ethan found himself scanning the crowd for Isabel. She stood by the dessert table, chatting animatedly with another bridesmaid. Her hands moved as she spoke, her expressive gestures adding an extra layer of life to her words. Ethan smiled to himself, his curiosity growing. She was a puzzle he wanted to solve, a mystery that begged to be unraveled. When their eyes met again across the crowd, Isabel raised her glass in a playful salute, her lips quirking into a mischievous grin. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before raising his own in response. For the rest of the evening, he couldn't shake the image of Isabel from his mind. There was something about her presence that felt different, something magnetic, unexplainable, and utterly captivating. As the night wore on, Ethan made a decision. He had to speak to her, if only to satisfy the questions swirling in his mind. Who was Isabel Morgan? What was it about her that made her feel like a spark in the middle of his otherwise carefully controlled life? With a determined stride, he began weaving through the crowd, his sights set on the enigmatic bridesmaid who had already begun to rewrite the rules of his world. The reception was in full swing, the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and a lively jazz band filling the garden. Guests danced beneath the canopy of twinkling lights, the air fragrant with roses and citrus. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the dance floor, his sharp eyes scanning for one person, Isabel Morgan. He spotted her near the outdoor bar, leaning casually against the counter. Her lavender dress caught the light, giving her an ethereal glow. She had kicked off her borrowed flats and stood barefoot on the grass, one hand holding a glass of champagne, the other brushing a stray strand of auburn hair from her face. Ethan hesitated. It wasn't often he felt uncertain about approaching someone, but something about Isabel felt different. She wasn't the type to be impressed by charm or wealth. He could sense that much. If he wanted to talk to her, he'd have to be genuine, a quality he wasn't often required to draw upon in his world of business negotiations and social climbing. Summoning his resolve, he strode toward her. "You certainly know how to make an entrance," he said, his deep voice cutting through the ambient noise. Isabel turned, surprised, but her lips quickly curved into a wry smile. "Ah, yes, the bridesmaid with two different shoes. I'm sure that'll be the talk of the wedding for weeks." Her tone was self-deprecating, but there was a spark in her hazel eyes that told Ethan she wasn't one to wallow in embarrassment. "Well, I'd call it memorable," he replied, "though I doubt anyone else could pull it off quite like you." She chuckled, taking a sip of her champagne. Flattery from the millionaire guest. "I didn't expect that." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her candidness. "You know who I am?" "Clara may have mentioned it," Isabel admitted, setting her glass down. The enigmatic Ethan Carter. Successful, ambitious, and apparently not a fan of waiting. Ethan laughed, caught off guard by her boldness. "Guilty as charged. Though I have to say, You're full of surprises yourself. Most people would have been mortified walking in late like that. She shrugged, her expression light but thoughtful. Life's too short to worry about perfect entrances. Besides, weddings are about the bride and groom, not the bridesmaid who couldn't find matching shoes. Ethan studied her for a moment, appreciating the way she carried herself with such unpretentious confidence. She wasn't like the women he was used to, polished, rehearsed, always careful to present their best angles. Isabel was refreshingly real, and it only made her more captivating. "You're right," he said, surprising even himself. "But I still think you stole the show, whether you meant to or not." Isabel tilted her head, her smile softening. "And here I thought you'd be one of those guys who says all the right things to get what he wants." "Maybe I am," Ethan replied, a playful edge to his tone. "But tonight, I just wanted to meet you." Her laughter came easily, a sound that seemed to melt away the noise of the crowd around them. "Well, congratulations. Mission accomplished." Ethan extended his hand, palm up. "Then how about a dance? Unless you're planning to leave another lasting impression by refusing me." Isabel hesitated, her eyes narrowing in mock suspicion. "You're not the kind of guy who takes no for an answer, are you?" "Not often," Ethan admitted, his grin disarming. With a dramatic sigh, Isabel placed her hand in his. "Fine, one dance. But if you step on my toes, you're buying me a new pair of shoes." He led her to the dance floor, where the band had transitioned to a slow, romantic tune. As they began to move, Ethan was struck by how natural it felt to hold her. Isabel, for all her earlier chaos, was a graceful dancer. She followed his lead effortlessly, her steps light and fluid. "You're full of contradictions," Ethan murmured as they swayed to the music. "Is that a compliment?" she asked, her brow arching. "Absolutely," he replied without hesitation. "You're nothing like anyone I've ever met." Her expression softened, and for a moment, her guard seemed to lower. "I could say the same about you, though I imagine you hear that all the time." Ethan shook his head. "Not like this." Their gazes locked, the air between them charged with a palpable energy. The rest of the world seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them and the rhythm of the music. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so drawn to someone, so completely captivated. But just as he thought the moment might stretch into something more, Isabel pulled back slightly, her smile tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Hesitation, perhaps, or the hint of a secret she wasn't ready to share. "Thank you for the dance," she said softly as the song ended, stepping away. Before Ethan could respond, Isabel disappeared into the crowd, leaving him standing alone on the dance floor. His hand hung in the air for a moment, empty, before he let it drop to his side. Watching her retreating figure, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions: curiosity, frustration, and a desire he couldn't fully explain. Isabel Morgan was a mystery, and he wasn't the kind of man to walk away from a puzzle without solving it. One thing was certain: he wasn't ready to let this moment be their last. The laughter and music of the reception continued to flow, but for Ethan, the night had shifted. Isabel's sudden departure from the dance floor left an ache he couldn't quite explain. His mind replayed their moments together, the teasing glint in her hazel eyes, the warmth of her laughter, and the way her guard slipped for just a heartbeat when they danced. But something else lingered, too: the hesitation he'd seen in her expression before she walked away. It wasn't shyness or mere disinterest. It was deeper, like the shadow of something she carried with her. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Isabel Morgan than met the eye. He scanned the crowd, hoping to spot her again. It didn't take long. She was standing near the edge of the garden, her champagne glass dangling loosely from her fingers as she stared out at the vineyard. The setting sun bathed her in a golden light, but the look on her face was distant, almost melancholic. Ethan moved toward her, his footsteps quiet against the soft grass. He didn't want to startle her, but Isabel seemed to sense his approach anyway. She turned just as he reached her side, her expression shifting into a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ethan," she said lightly, "couldn't find another dance partner?" "I doubt anyone else could measure up," he replied, his tone playful but sincere. Her lips twitched in amusement, but she quickly turned her gaze back to the horizon. Careful. Flattery might get you into trouble. Trouble's never scared me, Ethan said, studying her closely. But you seem like someone who's used to keeping people at arm's length. Isabel stiffened, the easy humor in her demeanor fading. Is that so? You tell me, he said gently. 1 minute, we're dancing, and it feels like we've known each other forever. The next, you're gone, and I'm standing there wondering if I imagined it all. She let out a soft laugh, but it lacked the warmth of earlier. You're perceptive. I'll give you that. Isabel, he said, his voice quieter now, why do I get the feeling you're running from something? For a moment, she didn't answer. The wind rustled through the vines, carrying the faint scent of lavender and earth. Finally, she sighed, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. I'm not running, she said carefully. I just don't like getting too comfortable in moments that don't last. Ethan frowned. Why wouldn't they last? She hesitated, then shook her head. It's complicated. Before he could press further, a flash from the corner of his eye caught his attention. He turned and saw a photographer snapping candid shots of the reception. Isabel noticed, too. Her reaction was immediate. Her body tensed, her shoulders stiffening as if bracing for impact. Hey, Ethan said softly, stepping closer. Are you okay? I'm fine, she replied quickly, but her tone betrayed her unease. She placed her glass on a nearby table and took a small step back, creating space between them. I just don't like having my picture taken. That's all. Ethan didn't believe her, not entirely, but he didn't push. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands trembled slightly as she brushed her hair behind her ear. Let me walk you back to the reception, he offered. She hesitated, then shook her head. No, thank you. I think I'll call it a night. You're leaving already? It's been a long day, Isabel said, her smile faint but polite. Besides, I'm sure you'll survive without me. Ethan watched as she turned and walked toward the parking area. Every instinct told him to follow her, but he stopped himself. Something about the way she moved, the slight slump of her shoulders, the deliberate pace of her steps, told him she needed space. Still, as he stood there under the fading light, watching her disappear into the distance, Ethan knew this wasn't the end. He couldn't shake the feeling that Isabel was a puzzle worth solving, a story waiting to be uncovered. That night, as the reception continued around him, Ethan found himself replaying every moment they'd shared. Her laughter, her teasing wit, her fleeting vulnerability. It all lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't forget. And though he didn't know it yet, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and about her. Days had passed since the wedding, but Isabel Morgan remained a vivid presence in Ethan Carter's mind. He found himself replaying their conversations, analyzing her words, her expressions, the subtle tension that flickered beneath her composed exterior. For a man who thrived on strategy and problem-solving, the enigma of Isabel was both maddening and intriguing. Seated at his office desk, Ethan was surrounded by files and reports demanding his attention, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Even the stunning view from his corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Francisco skyline, failed to hold his focus. He tapped a pen against his desk, the rhythm punctuating his restless thoughts, until he gave in to the impulse that had been building since the wedding. Grabbing his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Clara's name. The bride picked up on the second ring, her voice cheerful. Ethan, to what do I owe the pleasure? I hope this isn't a bad time, he began, leaning back in his chair. Not at all, Clara said. What's on your mind? Ethan hesitated for a moment, then decided there was no point in beating around the bush. I wanted to ask you about Isabel. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Clara responded, her tone more guarded. What about her? She left quite an impression, he admitted. I haven't been able to stop thinking about her since the wedding, but I got the sense she's carrying something. Something she doesn't want people to know. Clara sighed. Ethan, I know you mean well, but Isabel's been through a lot. She's very private for a reason. I'm not trying to invade her privacy, he said quickly. I just want to understand her, to get to know her. I get that, Clara replied, her voice softening. But Isabel doesn't trust easily. It's not personal. She's just learned to be cautious. What happened to her? Ethan asked, his curiosity sharpened. Clara hesitated again, then said, It's not my story to tell. But if you really care about getting to know her, start small. Be patient. Isabel isn't the type to open up just because someone asks. Her words stayed with him long after their conversation ended. Ethan respected Isabel's need for privacy, but his curiosity had only deepened. He decided to take Clara's advice and approach the situation carefully. The next day, Ethan tracked down the art gallery where Isabel worked. He didn't call ahead or send an email. He wanted their meeting to feel natural, not calculated. As he stepped into the gallery, he was greeted by the scent of fresh paint and the quiet hum of classical music. The space was filled with vibrant, evocative pieces, abstract landscapes, surreal portraits, and sculptures that seemed to breathe with life. Behind the counter, Isabel stood absorbed in her work, her fingers deftly arranging a display of handmade pottery. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She looked different than she had at the wedding. More relaxed, more herself. Ethan cleared his throat, and Isabel looked up, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. Ethan? I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, offering a small smile. What are you doing here? She asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and wariness. I wanted to see the gallery, he said simply, and to say hello. Her expression softened, though her guard didn't fully drop. Well, you've seen it. Hello. He chuckled, stepping closer. Clara mentioned you worked here. She wasn't kidding when she said you have an eye for beauty. Isabel's cheeks flushed slightly, but she brushed off the compliment with a small shrug. It's a job. A place where I can focus on something that isn't complicated. There it was again, that hint of something unspoken. Ethan decided to tread carefully. Art can be an escape, he said, glancing around at the pieces on display. But I think it can also tell stories. What's your story, Isabel? Her gaze flickered, and she crossed her arms over her chest, a subtle barrier. That's a loaded question. Then let me rephrase, he said, leaning casually against the counter. What's your favorite piece here? Something that speaks to you. For a moment, she seemed caught off guard by the question. Then, after a pause, she gestured toward a painting in the corner, a swirling abstract of deep blues and fiery oranges. It's called Rebirth, she said quietly. The artist said it's about finding strength in chaos. Ethan studied the painting, the dynamic contrast of colors and textures. It's beautiful, he said, and fitting. She tilted her head. Fitting? For someone like you, he replied. Someone who's stronger than they let on. Isabel's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to decipher his intentions. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen, and her expression shifted, anxiety flickering across her features. I have to take this, she said abruptly, grabbing the phone. Of course, Ethan said, stepping back. As she walked away, her voice low and tense as she answered the call, Ethan felt a surge of determination. Isabel's story might be complicated, but he wasn't about to give up. He had seen a glimpse of the real Isabel Morgan. The strength behind her walls, the vulnerability she tried to hide, and he wanted to know more. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. The rain had started softly, a quiet drizzle tapping against the glass of the coffee shop's windows, adding a cozy backdrop to the unfolding scene. Isabel sat across from Ethan, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the ripples in her drink as if it held answers to questions she didn't want to voice. Ethan, on the other hand, watched her intently. He noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly on the cup when he asked about her favorite artists and how her eyes lit up, if only briefly, when she spoke about her gallery work. It was a small victory, seeing her passion peek through the guarded walls she so carefully maintained. So, he said after a lull in the conversation, leaning back in his chair, what made you choose art? Isabel hesitated, her expression momentarily thoughtful. Art doesn't judge, she said finally, her voice soft but steady. It doesn't care where you've been or what you've done. It just exists. And sometimes, it feels like it understands things words can't explain. Ethan nodded, captivated by the sincerity in her tone. That's beautiful, he said. And very you. She raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're someone who sees beyond the surface, he replied. You look for meaning where most people don't bother to. A faint blush colored her cheeks, but Isabel quickly masked it with a sip of tea. That's generous of you to say, she muttered. It's the truth, Ethan said, leaning forward slightly. You have a way of making the world seem bigger, more interesting. Isabel's lips quirked into a small, reluctant smile. Careful, Ethan. You're starting to sound like you're trying to impress me. Maybe I am, he admitted, his eyes holding hers. The honesty in his voice startled her, and for a moment, Isabel didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to someone being so direct, so unflinchingly sincere. It was disarming. Well, she said finally, her voice quieter, you're doing a good job. Ethan's smile widened, but he didn't press further. Instead, he steered the conversation toward lighter topics, asking about her favorite coffee shops, books, and the places she'd visited. Slowly, Isabel began to relax. She even laughed, a soft, melodic sound that Ethan found himself wanting to hear more of. As the conversation flowed, the rain outside intensified, casting a silver sheen over the streets. The coffee shop grew quieter as patrons trickled out, leaving the two of them cocooned in their own little world. But then Isabel's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. She glanced at the screen, her expression instantly clouding over. Everything okay? Ethan asked, noting the sudden shift in her demeanor. Yeah, she said quickly, slipping the phone into her bag. Just work stuff. Her voice was calm, but the tension in her posture told a different story. Ethan wanted to ask more, to pry, but he knew better. Pushing her would only make her retreat further. I should probably get going, Isabel said, standing abruptly. Already? Ethan asked, though he kept his tone light. It's getting late, she said, avoiding his gaze. Thank you for the tea. And the company. Before he could respond, she was already heading toward the door, her bag slung over her shoulder. Ethan watched her go, frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Every time he thought they were making progress, she pulled away, leaving him with more questions than answers. But he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The next morning, Ethan found himself back in his office, distracted once again. He tapped his fingers on his desk, his thoughts circling around Isabel. Her laughter, her guardedness, the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, it all lingered in his mind. He picked up his phone, tempted to call her, but he stopped himself. Isabel needed space. If he pushed too hard, he might lose the fragile connection they'd started to build. Instead, he sent a text. Ethan, thanks for letting me steal your time yesterday. I hope your work stuff didn't cause too much trouble. He stared at the screen, debating whether to add more, but ultimately decided to leave it at that. To his surprise, her reply came quickly. Isabel, it was nice. Thank you for the tea. The simple response brought a small smile to his face. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Across town, Isabel sat at her kitchen table, her phone in hand. She reread Ethan's text, her heart tugging in two directions. Part of her wanted to let him in, to allow herself the comfort of his easy charm and genuine kindness. But the other part, the louder part, warned her against it. People like Ethan didn't stay, not when they found out the truth. She put her phone down and stared out the window, the city skyline blurred by the remnants of rain on the glass. For now, she'd keep her walls up. It was safer that way. But as she sat there, the memory of Ethan's warm smile and earnest eyes lingered, refusing to be ignored. Ethan couldn't get Isabel out of his mind. Days turned into a week, and while their text exchanges were polite and sporadic, they lacked the depth Ethan craved. She was keeping him at arm's length, and he hated it. Something about her stirred a protectiveness in him, a desire to break through her defenses and show her she didn't have to face whatever burdened her alone. Unable to shake his curiosity, Ethan turned to an old friend, Marcus Hayes. Marcus was a journalist with a knack for uncovering buried stories, and Ethan knew he could be discreet. Over coffee at a downtown cafe, Ethan laid it out. "I need your help," Ethan began. "I met someone. She's complicated. I want to understand her better, but she's not the type to open up easily." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to dig?" "Only enough to give me context," Ethan clarified. "I don't want to invade her privacy, but I think she's carrying something heavy. I want to help her." Marcus considered this, then nodded. "Send me what you know. I'll see what I can find." It took Marcus less than 3 days to come back with answers. Later that evening, Ethan sat in his office, staring at the file Marcus had sent. The information inside confirmed his suspicions. Isabel Morgan wasn't just a private person. She was someone who had spent years trying to escape her past. Her father, Henry Bennett, had once been a titan in the financial world, known for his charisma and ruthless business acumen. But everything crumbled when a massive embezzlement scandal came to light. Billions of dollars vanished, and countless lives were ruined. Henry was arrested, tried, and sentenced to prison. But the fallout didn't stop there. The media descended on the Bennett family, tearing them apart in the public eye. Isabel, then just a teenager, had borne the brunt of the scrutiny. Ethan's chest tightened as he read the details. Isabel had disappeared from the public eye shortly after her father's conviction. She changed her name, moved across the country, and rebuilt her life piece by piece. But no matter how far she ran, her past lingered like a shadow. The next day, Ethan drove to the art gallery. He didn't call ahead. He needed to see Isabel, to speak to her directly. This wasn't a conversation for texts or calls. Isabel was rearranging a display when Ethan walked in. She looked up, surprised but not entirely displeased to see him. "Ethan," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "This is unexpected." "I needed to see you," he said, his voice steady. There was something in his tone that made Isabel pause. She set down the vase she was holding and gestured toward a quiet corner of the gallery. "What's going on?" They sat across from each other at a small table near the back, the quiet hum of the gallery providing a semblance of privacy. Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I know who you are, Isabel," he said gently. Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked as though she might flee. "What are you talking about?" "Your father," Ethan said, his voice soft but firm. "Henry Bennett." Isabel's breath hitched. She glanced around the gallery, her eyes darting toward the door as if calculating the quickest escape route. But Ethan reached out, his hand hovering near hers. "Please don't run," he said. "I'm not here to judge you or your family. I just want to understand." Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. She looked down at her hands, her voice barely a whisper. "How did you find out?" "I asked a friend to look into your past," he admitted. "I didn't want to pry, but I needed to know what you were hiding." Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger. "You had no right." "I know," he interrupted, his tone apologetic. "And I'm sorry. But Isabel, I care about you. And I could see that something was holding you back. I didn't want to push you, but I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." She exhaled sharply, her anger giving way to weariness. "You don't understand what it's like," she said, her voice trembling. "To have your entire life ripped apart, to be blamed for things you didn't do. Everywhere I went, people whispered about me, about my family. I couldn't escape it, so I left. I changed my name, moved here, and started over." "And you've built a beautiful life for yourself," Ethan said. "But you don't have to carry this alone anymore." Isabel shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You say that now, but people like you, people with influence and reputations to protect, you can't afford to be associated with someone like me." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "Isabel, listen to me. I don't care about what the world thinks. I care about you. The woman who loves art, who has a wicked sense of humor, who made me see the world differently from the moment we met." Her resolve wavered, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. But it was fleeting. She pulled her hands away, her walls rising again. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't risk dragging you into my mess." "You're not dragging me into anything," Ethan countered. "This is my choice, and I'm not going anywhere." But Isabel stood, her movements abrupt. "I need time," she said, her voice shaky. "Please, Ethan. Just give me time." Ethan watched her walk away, his heart heavy. He hadn't convinced her. Not yet. But he wasn't giving up. Isabel Morgan was worth fighting for, and Ethan Carter wasn't a man who backed down from a challenge. The days that followed were a tumultuous storm of emotions for Isabel. Ethan's words lingered in her mind, replaying over and over, each one striking a chord she had buried long ago. He had seen her for who she truly was, not the daughter of a disgraced financier, not the woman running from her past, but simply Isabel, and that terrified her. She poured herself into her work at the gallery, hoping to lose herself in the vibrant colors of the paintings and the meticulous arrangement of sculptures. But no amount of art could distract her from the weight of her decision. Could she trust Ethan? Could she let him into her carefully rebuilt life without risking everything she had worked so hard to protect? Ethan, on the other hand, was resolute. He had given Isabel the space she asked for, but every passing day only strengthened his determination to stand by her side. He saw her struggle, her vulnerability, and her strength, and he knew he couldn't let her slip away without a fight. A week later, Ethan decided to reach out again. This time, he sent a handwritten letter, delivered to her gallery in an envelope simply marked with her name. "Dear Isabel, I don't want to push you, and I don't want to overwhelm you, but I need you to know that I meant every word I said. You are not defined by your past, and I refuse to let the world dictate who you are or what you deserve. You've built something beautiful for yourself, a life full of meaning and creativity. But I see the walls you've put up, and I understand why they're there. I just hope you'll trust me enough to let me in, even a little. You don't have to decide now. Take all the time you need. Just know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Yours, Ethan." When Isabel received the letter, her hands trembled as she opened it. The words were simple yet profound, carrying a sincerity she couldn't ignore. She read it twice, then a third time, her heart wavering between fear and hope. That evening, Isabel sat on the balcony of her apartment, the city lights stretching out before her like a sea of stars. The letter lay on the table beside her, its presence both comforting and unsettling. She thought about her father, about the man who had once been her hero and the scandal that had torn him down. She thought about the reporters who had hounded her family, the whispers and stares that followed her wherever she went. But mostly, she thought about the emptiness that had settled in her heart after she walked away from it all. Ethan's words had stirred something in her, something she hadn't felt in years. The possibility of being truly seen, of being loved despite her flaws and scars. But could she risk it? Could she let herself be vulnerable again, knowing the pain it might bring? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Ethan. "Ethan, no pressure, but I'll be at the park tomorrow afternoon if you feel like talking. If not, I'll wait until you're ready." Isabel stared at the message, her heart pounding. She knew she had a choice to make. She could keep running, keep hiding, or she could take a chance on the man who had shown her nothing but patience and kindness. The next afternoon, Ethan stood near the fountain in the park, his hands tucked into his pockets. The autumn breeze rustled the leaves around him, and the chatter of children playing filled the air. He glanced at his watch, trying not to let disappointment settle in. He hadn't expected Isabel to come, but part of him had hoped. Just as he was about to leave, he saw her. She was walking toward him, her coat wrapped tightly around her and her hair tousled by the wind. Her expression was unreadable, but the fact that she was there was enough to make his heart leap. "Hi," she said softly as she approached. "Hi," he replied, his voice equally gentle. They stood in silence for a moment, the space between them charged with unspoken words. Finally, Isabel broke the silence. "I got your letter," she said. "And your text." Ethan nodded. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I almost didn't come," she admitted, her eyes fixed on the ground. "But I couldn't stop thinking about what you said." "And?" he prompted, his heart hammering in his chest. She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "And I'm tired of running," she said. "I don't know how to do this, Ethan. I don't know how to let someone in without feeling like everything will fall apart." "You don't have to do it alone," he said, stepping closer. We can figure it out together. Isabel hesitated, her walls still half raised. But what if it's too much? What if my past ruins everything? Ethan reached out, gently taking her hands in his. Then we'll deal with it. Together. Isabel, I'm not afraid of your past. I'm afraid of losing you. Her breath hitched, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face the world alone. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, I don't want to lose you either. Ethan pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her as the weight of her fears began to lift. For the first time, Isabel felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, beautiful hope that perhaps she could build something new, something real, with Ethan by her side. The days following Isabel's decision to trust Ethan were a blur of quiet moments and tentative steps forward. They spent hours together, walking through the park, having coffee in cozy cafes, and even sharing late-night conversations that stretched into the early morning. Isabel began to feel the walls she'd spent years constructing around her heart slowly crumble. There were moments of laughter, moments of silence, and moments when words weren't enough. But their connection deepened with each passing day. Ethan was patient, understanding. He never pressured her to reveal more than she was ready to share. But Isabel knew it was only a matter of time before the truth of her past would come out, and when it did, would he still see her the same way? It wasn't long before their relationship began to attract attention. The first whispers started at an art gala, a gathering of the city's wealthiest patrons and critics. Isabel had agreed to attend with Ethan, though the thought of stepping back into the public made her stomach churn. She had spent years distancing herself from events like this, and yet here she was, standing beside Ethan, who was a regular fixture in circles like these. As they entered the venue, the air shifted. Isabel noticed the subtle glances, the lowered voices behind the raised champagne glasses. She could feel their eyes on her, and she knew. She knew. They weren't seeing the artist, the woman she had become. They were seeing the daughter of Henry Bennett, the disgraced financier whose scandal had rocked the country. She caught a glimpse of an older woman, her eyes narrowing as she whispered to a companion, her voice just loud enough for Isabel to hear. That's her. The daughter of that Bennett guy. They say she's in with Ethan Carter now. What a mess. Isabel's heart sank. She tried to push the voices out of her mind, but the weight of their judgment was too much. She was no longer the quiet woman she had been a week ago. The world was noticing her, and not in the way she had hoped. Ethan sensed the change in her. You okay? He asked quietly, his hand slipping into hers. Isabel managed a tight smile, but the warmth in her eyes was gone. I'm fine, she said, though her voice trembled slightly. Just tired. They didn't stay long after that. Ethan guided her out of the gala, his arm around her shoulder. As they stepped into the cool night air, Isabel felt a sense of relief. But even as she leaned into Ethan, she could feel the weight of the world pressing in on her. The next morning, the storm hit. A tabloid magazine with a flashy cover headline burst into public view. Billionaire heiress dating controversial businessman. Is she trying to reclaim her family's wealth? The image was a grainy one, showing Isabel and Ethan at the gala the night before, their heads close, their expressions intimate. The article wasn't much better, with insinuations that Isabel was using her relationship with Ethan to climb back into the high society her father had once ruled over. The words were sharp, cruel, painting her as nothing more than a gold digger, a manipulator. Isabel stared at the magazine in disbelief, her hands shaking as she read the accusations. It felt like the walls she had so carefully built around her were being torn down again, one scandalous headline at a time. Ethan had seen the tabloid as well. By the time he arrived at her apartment, Isabel was already pacing, her thoughts racing in 1,000 different directions. Isabel, he said, his voice calm but firm. I saw it too. She turned to face him, her face flushed with anger. I can't believe this is happening. I'm not the person they say I am. I didn't want any of this. Her voice broke, the frustration and fear she'd been holding back spilling over. I know you didn't, Ethan said gently, stepping forward and placing a hand on her arm. But they don't care about the truth. They care about the story they can sell, and they'll spin it any way they want. Isabel pulled away from him, pacing again. You don't understand. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. I was trying to be invisible, to build a life without anyone knowing who I am. And now it's all crashing down. Ethan's heart ached as he watched her. He had always known the world could be cruel, but seeing her so exposed, so raw, it felt personal. He wanted to fix it, to shield her from the pain she was going through. But he also knew that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't control what the world said about her. "We'll get through this," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere, Isabel." Her eyes flashed with pain. "You shouldn't be here, Ethan. You're going to get caught in this mess, too. Your business partners, your friends, they'll all turn against you. They'll say you're just as bad as I am. And I won't let you do that for me." "Isabel," he said, his voice firm, "I want to be here. I don't care what anyone says. This is my choice. And I'm not going to let you push me away because of a few lies. I've been through worse than this. I know how to handle the fallout." But Isabel shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us. It's about everything I've worked for. I built this life from nothing. I can't let it all be destroyed." Ethan stood still, his gaze unwavering. "You're not alone anymore. I'm with you, no matter what." Isabel's heart trembled as she looked at him. She knew he was sincere, but the fear was still there. The fear that her past would destroy everything. Would he still be by her side once the full extent of her past came to light? The fallout was swift. Ethan's business partners began to question his judgment. The media frenzy surrounding Isabel and her family grew louder by the day, and whispers in the business world spread like wildfire. Some of his friends distanced themselves, wary of being linked to a woman with such a controversial past. But Ethan stood firm, refusing to bow to the pressure. "This is my life," he declared to his partners. "I make my own choices, and I choose Isabel. If you don't like it, then maybe this isn't the right partnership." Isabel was ashamed, feeling like she was the cause of Ethan's growing struggles. But he reassured her time and again that he didn't regret a single moment of their time together. The media didn't let up. They hounded both Ethan and Isabel, following their every move, digging deeper into their lives. Rumors flew that Ethan was falling in love with Isabel for all the wrong reasons, that he was blinded by her beauty and charm, forgetting the reputation he had built. Isabel knew this wasn't true. Ethan wasn't some naive man who had been fooled by her, but the constant scrutiny, the negative press, and the growing distance between them made her feel like she was sinking. It was then that she realized something vital. If she truly wanted to protect herself, and if she truly wanted to protect the man she loved, she had to stand up. She couldn't let the world dictate their relationship. The weight of the world was pressing down on Isabel. Each headline, each tabloid story, each critical whisper felt like a brick added to the pile of pressure that threatened to crush her. Yet through it all, Ethan stood by her, unwavering, and as each day passed, she began to realize just how much she needed him. Not just for his strength, but for his belief in her, the belief that she had long lost in herself. The media onslaught continued, and Isabel withdrew further into herself, battling the shame of her past, the guilt of dragging Ethan into the spotlight, and the fear that all of this would one day tear them apart. She tried to keep her composure, focusing on her art, the only thing that had ever truly grounded her. But her heart was heavy, burdened by the storm swirling around her. Ethan, however, remained relentless. He didn't want to let her hide away from the world. He saw the brilliance in her, not just in her art, but in her heart. He could see that Isabel was on the edge of breaking, and he knew he had to be the one to pull her back from it before she disappeared into the shadows. It was a cold morning when Ethan decided to confront Isabel. He had watched her retreat further and further, isolating herself from everything and everyone, including him. It was time to fight for her again, to remind her that the world could not take her light from him, not when he was willing to fight for her until the very end. He arrived at the gallery early, the doors still locked, and stood outside for a long moment, taking in the gray sky and the distant hum of the city. The familiar scent of wet concrete and fresh paint filled the air. Inside, he knew Isabel would be working on her latest piece, her escape, her therapy. But today, Ethan needed more than just to watch her lose herself in the strokes of a brush. He pushed the door open with a firm hand, and the faint jingle of the bell above greeted him. The gallery was empty, the silence stretching in front of him like a vast sea, but he knew where she would be. Upstairs, in the studio. When he found her, she was sitting on the floor, a canvas propped in front of her. She hadn't even noticed him enter. She was completely lost in her work, her face illuminated by the soft light coming through the high windows. He stood there for a moment, watching her, admiring the way she could disappear into the art as though it were the only thing that mattered. It was then that Isabel looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. "Ethan?" He didn't respond with words, instead crossing the room to where she sat. He crouched down beside her, his hand gently touching the edge of the canvas. She looked down, the tension in her shoulders betraying the turmoil that was churning inside her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I've been distant. I don't know how to handle all of this. I thought I could, but I'm losing myself. And you don't deserve this." Ethan's heart twisted at her words. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable, and yet he could feel the strength in her, a strength that was buried beneath the layers of fear and doubt. He reached out, cupping her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You're not losing yourself, Isabel," he said softly. "You're just afraid. You're afraid of your past, afraid of what the world will think, and afraid of losing everything you've worked so hard to build." He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "But Isabel, none of that matters. What matters is that you're here, with me, and I'm not going anywhere. I will stand by you, no matter what." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart. I can't stand the thought of you losing everything because of me." Ethan's thumb gently brushed away the tear that slipped down her cheek. "I'm not going to lose everything, and if I do, then it's a price I'm willing to pay to have you in my life. You're worth it, Isabel, and we're going to get through this together." She stared at him, her breath hitching. The sincerity in his eyes, the unwavering devotion in his voice, left her breathless. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe in something more than her fears. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "You won't," he promised. "We're in this together, and I'll fight for you, every step of the way." The days that followed felt different. The weight on Isabel's chest began to lift, not because the media stopped attacking her, but because Ethan had given her something far more valuable: hope. She started to take small steps outside of her cocoon. She answered the phone when friends called. She began to show up at events again, walking into rooms with her head held higher, no longer shrinking from the stares. She wasn't going to hide anymore. And slowly, the world started to see her not as the daughter of a disgraced financier, but as Isabel Carter, a woman of strength, of resilience, of integrity. Her art began to gain recognition once more, and the whispers in the galleries and at the charity events shifted from gossip to admiration. Ethan remained by her side through it all, the bond between them growing stronger with each challenge they faced. He never once faltered, never once looked at her with anything less than admiration and love. He reminded her daily that she was more than her past, more than what the world thought of her. One evening, as they walked through a park near the edge of the city, Ethan took her hand and pulled her close. The air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of gold and violet as the sun set behind them. The city, with all its noise and chaos, seemed a world away. Isabel paused, looking up at him. "You've been so patient with me," she said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you." Ethan smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair away from her face. "You don't need to thank me. I'm not here for gratitude. I'm here because I love you. And that's enough." For a moment, Isabel didn't know what to say. She had never allowed herself to truly feel loved, not like this. But as she looked into his eyes, she felt it. All the doubts, all the fears that had once held her back began to melt away. She was ready to believe, to hope, and to love again. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with more sincerity than she had ever felt. Ethan's face lit up with a smile that took her breath away. "Then let's make the most of it. Let's build something that no one can tear down." The gallery was alive with energy, the walls adorned with vibrant colors, every stroke of paint telling a story of resilience, of struggles faced and conquered. People milled about, admiring the work, discussing the pieces with a newfound reverence, no longer seeing Isabel as just a woman with a complicated past, but as a force to be reckoned with, a brilliant artist in her own right. It had been weeks since she'd taken the step to embrace the world again, to let Ethan's unwavering love ground her and remind her of who she was. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, Isabel had taken a huge leap forward. The art gallery exhibit that Ethan had arranged in her honor was more than just an event. It was a testament to the woman she had become and the woman she was still becoming. Ethan had spared no expense in ensuring the night was perfect, every detail meticulously planned, from the lighting that bathed the pieces in a soft glow to the music playing in the background, setting a serene, elegant tone. He had invited some of the most influential people in the art world, as well as the media, but most importantly, he had made sure the people who mattered most, those who had seen her struggle, those who had stood by her through the darkest times, were all there to witness her moment of triumph. Isabel had never expected to be here. When she first picked up a paintbrush all those years ago, it was never with the intention of becoming a celebrated artist. It had always been her escape, her way to deal with the overwhelming pressure of her past. But now, standing in the heart of this vibrant exhibit, surrounded by people who appreciated her work for what it truly was, she couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. As she moved through the gallery, greeting guests and discussing her pieces, her confidence grew. She no longer saw herself through the lens of her father's mistakes or the media's constant judgment. Tonight, she saw herself as Isabel Carter, an artist, a woman who had fought for her place in the world and had earned every accolade that came her way. The room hummed with energy, but Isabel couldn't help but notice the one constant, Ethan, standing quietly in the background, his eyes never straying far from her. He was proud of her, and the admiration in his gaze made her heart swell with affection. He had been with her through every step of this journey, and tonight, more than ever, she knew that their love had been the foundation of her strength. After some time, the crowd began to quiet down as the final guests arrived. Isabel found herself standing before one of her most personal pieces, a large canvas that depicted a woman standing alone on a cliff, facing the vast expanse of an ocean. It was a piece she had poured her soul into, a reflection of everything she had been through. The fear, the pain, the loneliness, and ultimately, the peace that came with embracing it all. Ethan approached her slowly, his footsteps deliberate, the sound of his shoes muted against the polished floors. He stood beside her, his presence warm and comforting, as if he could shield her from any lingering doubt that threatened to creep back into her mind. "You've done it, Isabel," he said, his voice low, filled with awe. She turned her head to look at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ethan's eyes softened, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "You always had it in you. I just gave you the space to see it. I've never been more proud of you." Isabel felt the lump in her throat grow, a rush of emotion threatening to spill over. She had spent so long feeling like she wasn't enough, like she was just a product of her past mistakes. But here, with Ethan by her side, she could finally see that she was more than that. She was Isabel Carter, a woman who had fought for the life she wanted, a woman who was ready to embrace her future. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. Ethan smiled, his hand still resting on her arm. "No, thank you. You've proven to me that there's nothing we can't face together." As the night wore on, the crowd began to thin. Isabel and Ethan remained by the exhibit, their quiet corner a retreat from the bustle of the gallery. The final moments of the event felt surreal to Isabel. The past was no longer something she had to hide from. It was something she had learned to accept, to integrate into who she was now. The public's perception of her no longer controlled her sense of self-worth. And as the night drew to a close, and the last guests made their way out, Isabel found herself standing at the threshold of a new chapter in her life. It was one where she was no longer defined by her past mistakes, but by her courage, her art, and the love she had found in Ethan. A week later, the media buzz had died down, the scandal surrounding her family's past becoming little more than a distant memory. Isabel had started to find peace in the chaos that once defined her life. The whispers of judgment had quieted, replaced by admiration from those who saw her for the woman she had become. And then, one afternoon, as she stood in her studio, preparing for her next series of paintings, Ethan walked in, a familiar look of determination on his face. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious but gentle. Isabel set her paintbrush down, her heart skipping a beat. "What's wrong?" Ethan took a deep breath, stepping closer. "There's something I've been thinking about for a while now. Something I've wanted to ask you." Isabel's pulse quickened as she looked into his eyes. For a moment, she could see the weight of the decision he was about to make. The seriousness in his gaze told her this wasn't just another conversation. Without warning, Ethan dropped to one knee, his hand reaching into his pocket. Isabel gasped, her eyes widening in surprise as he pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring that caught the light in the most breathtaking way. "Isabel Carter," Ethan began, his voice steady, "I've stood by your side through every challenge, every fear, every triumph. You've shown me the kind of love that I never thought was possible, and now, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" For a moment, Isabel couldn't breathe. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had dreamed of but never thought would come. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at Ethan, the man who had given her everything she needed to find herself again, the man who had loved her through it all. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Ethan's face lit up with joy as he slid the ring onto her finger. He stood up, pulling her into his arms, and in that moment, Isabel knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. A new chapter, not just in her art, but in her life. A chapter where love, trust, and hope were the foundation of everything they would build together. The sun was setting once again over Napa Valley, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and gold, much like the very evening when Isabel and Ethan's paths had first crossed, at the heart of the gallery where she had begun to truly see herself as she was. The beauty of the landscape seemed to echo the serenity she felt deep within her now. It was hard to believe how far she had come from the terrified woman who had once hidden from the world, afraid that her past would overshadow everything she ever hoped to be. Today, as she stood on the same grounds, preparing to marry Ethan, she couldn't help but marvel at the life they had built together, brick by brick, moment by moment. The trials, the doubts, the fears, and the misunderstandings had all led them here, to this very moment where everything was perfectly aligned. They had worked through it all, their bond growing stronger with each passing day, and now, in the presence of their loved ones, they were about to step into forever. The soft rustling of the breeze mingled with the quiet murmur of voices as guests took their places. Ethan was waiting for her at the altar, dressed in a tailored suit that highlighted his quiet strength. His eyes, filled with love and unwavering certainty, were locked on the path where she would soon walk. He looked so much like the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, the man who had shown her what true love and partnership were all about. Isabel felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her as she stepped forward, arm linked with her mother's. Elise, her mother, looked at her with tears in her eyes, the same nurturing, steady presence she had always been. The woman who had guided Isabel through the darkest days, and whose quiet strength had been a pillar throughout her life. Now, Elise smiled, her pride and love shining through as she kissed Isabel's cheek and placed her hand into Ethan's. Isabel's heart swelled with gratitude. She had once been consumed by the idea that she wasn't enough, that her history would taint everything she touched. But now, standing here, surrounded by people who truly knew her, she realized just how much she had grown. She wasn't perfect, but she was complete. Ethan's hands wrapped around hers as she stood before him, and for a moment, all of the noise of the world around them faded away. It was just the two of them, standing on the precipice of a new beginning. "You look breathtaking," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze drinking in every detail of her. Isabel smiled softly, her lips trembling as she responded, "I'm just me, and that's enough." The officiant, who had been a longtime family friend, began speaking, but Isabel's attention was entirely fixed on Ethan. His smile, his touch, the way his eyes radiated the same love they always had, only stronger now, filled her heart with warmth. The vows were a blur to her. Words of love and promises, things they had already said to each other in private moments, now spoken before their friends and family. But they felt more real now, more alive, because they had withstood every challenge that life had thrown their way. When it was time for Ethan to speak, his voice cracked with emotion, and Isabel saw the vulnerability in his eyes, a vulnerability she had never seen before but recognized as something real and true. I, Ethan Matthews, stand here today knowing without a shadow of a doubt that I've found my soul's counterpart. Isabel, you've transformed my life in ways I can't even put into words. You've shown me what it means to love and be loved without reservation. You've made me a better man. And today, I promise to be by your side, always, to love you through the darkest of days and the brightest of days, to cherish every moment we have together, for as long as I live. Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes, and she whispered, I love you. The officiant nodded, giving Isabel the space to speak her vows. She had written them herself, drawn from the deepest corners of her heart. I, Isabel Carter, stand before you, Ethan, knowing that this moment has been a long time in the making. My journey to find peace with who I am, to embrace my past and the woman I am today, would have never been possible without you. Your love, your belief in me, has been my foundation. I promise to love you, to support you, to challenge you, and to stand by your side, no matter what comes our way. Together, we will face the world. The officiant smiled and looked at both of them, his voice warm. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ethan, you may kiss your bride. Ethan leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that spoke of everything they had built together. Years of joy, of pain, of growth, and of healing. The kiss was soft and deep, a promise sealed with their love, witnessed by those who had stood by them through it all. When they finally pulled away, they were met with applause. But Isabel's heart was so full she could hardly take it all in. There was no doubt, no fear anymore. She was where she belonged, beside the man who had stood by her side in every storm. As they walked down the aisle, hand in hand, the crowd cheered. But Isabel only had eyes for Ethan. She couldn't wait to begin their life together, a life where their love would continue to grow, where they would continue to support one another, and where no challenge would ever be too great to overcome. The reception was a celebration like no other. The room was filled with laughter, music, and dancing. It was a night of joy, of sharing love, and of creating new memories. Isabel and Ethan spent the evening surrounded by the people who had meant so much to them. Family, friends, colleagues, each person who had played a role in their story. Isabel felt a peace settle over her, a feeling that she was finally exactly where she was meant to be. As they shared their first dance as husband and wife, the music enveloped them, and Isabel rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, her heart overflowing with love. You were always meant for me, you know, Ethan murmured softly. Isabel looked up at him, her eyes shining with the truth of his words. And you for me. Under the soft glow of the lights, the world outside seemed to disappear. They were just two souls, forever intertwined, ready to face whatever came their way, together. And as the night drew to a close, Isabel realized that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. Together, they would create a future that was their own, a future filled with love, laughter, and a bond that nothing could ever break. Forever. Isabel and Ethan's story was one of resilience, love, and the healing power of time. Their journey was not without its scars, moments of doubt, pain, and uncertainty, but each trial brought them closer, helping them to understand themselves and each other more deeply. Through it all, they discovered what true love meant, not just accepting each other's flaws, but cherishing them, for those imperfections had shaped the strength and beauty of their bond. Their love was not a fairy tale where everything was perfect from the start, but a story of persistence, trust, and the courage to face the past and embrace the future. When Isabel no longer feared who she was, and Ethan became more than just her protector, but her partner. They had truly found each other, and that was what mattered most. The story ended under the breathtaking Napa Valley sunset, where their love had blossomed, and where they chose to move forward, hand in hand. A new chapter of their lives began, and Isabel knew that as long as she had Ethan by her side, no challenge would be too great, and no storm too fierce to weather. Together, they had built a future founded on love, trust, and perseverance, and that love would endure, timeless and unwavering, like the endless vineyards stretching beneath the warm glow of the evening sun. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me on this journey through Isabel and Ethan's story. Your support means the world, and I'm so grateful you followed along every step of the way. I hope their story resonated with you, as it was truly a tale of love, resilience, and the beauty of overcoming obstacles together. If you enjoyed this journey, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. Your feedback and engagement help me continue creating content that inspires and connects us all. Stay tuned for more exciting chapters, and until next time, take care and remember, love, trust, and perseverance will always lead the way. Thank you again for watching.